Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. Now, in spite the fact that this meditation is actually late, that you should have had it in March instead of in April, I think we are somewhat compensated by the fact that what we're going to read today are 5 delightfully comic pages. And also we're going to get through the whole of chapter 26. So that's another chapter behind us. The chapter begins with an epigraph from Shakespeare's play Troilus and Cressida. It's a play that I haven't read, I haven't seen performed, and normally my ideal would be to have read the play at the very least, but ideally to have read it and seen it performed before I prepared this meditation. That just was not possible. That was a little bit too much reading to be done in too short a time. However, I think it's enough that what we'll do is we'll touch on some things today, because I did do bits of reading in certain scenes and I could see some parallels right away. If I see some more, if I do go ahead, read the rest of the play and I begin to see more things that apply to Middlemarch, what you're going to find is we're just going to have little Troilus and Cressida discussions in later meditations. This play is set during the Trojan War. So anyone who's read the Iliad, you're going to see familiar names. You're going to see Ajax and Achilles and Hector and Priam, King Priam and Patroclus. What we're going to focus in on, of course, is where this quote comes from, which is Act 2, Scene 3. Now, it opens with us meeting this minor character called Thersites, who for the better part of Scene 1 in Act 2, he's been exchanging insults with Ajax and getting beaten up in return, basically. Ajax is trying to force Thersites to give him some knowledge of a proclamation that has been made in Act 1. And Ajax is convinced that Thersites knows something about this proclamation. It doesn't seem to me as though Thersites knows anything, but instead of saying as much, Thersites just insults him every time he asks for information. And in return, Ajax usually just seems to give him a belt around the head, and he seems to cope with that as best he can anyway, until the end of Act 2, Scene 1, and then there's another scene, and we skip forward to Scene 3, and we have Thersites all by himself, and he's obviously still kind of recovering from the high emotion of that exchange in Act 2, Scene 1. And so if we read his whole line, including the quotation, it reads like this. You've got the scene opening where it says, "Enter Thersites alone." So he's got the stage to himself. He can say what he really feels. And he says to himself, "How now, Thersites? What, lost in the labyrinth of thy fury, shall the elephant Ajax carry it thus? He beats me, and I rail at him. Oh, worthy satisfaction! Would it were otherwise, that I could beat him while he railed at me." So he's evaluating what has happened in Act 2, Scene 1, and wishes perhaps that he were the bigger, stronger of the two men in the contest, because, railing somebody, sending insults, doesn't hurt them, he thinks, anyway, quite as much as the blows that Ajax dealt to him. But I think we can sense the situation that Thersites has been, I think, unfairly punished. I mean, yes, he was very insulting in Scene 1, but his function seems to be like that of a fool, and a fool should be tolerated to some degree and be allowed to speak truth to those who are in power. The fact that Ajax doesn't like the truth and chooses to be violent, that almost seems to be taking things a little bit too far, being a little bit unfair. Thersites also is being punished for not knowing something that Ajax is convinced that he should know. This is reminding me of a situation when I was a lot younger. So we're going back into the 1990s now, when I did a lot of temping work. You stand in for someone who's on holiday or on maternity leave, or the office just needs a little bit of extra staff for a short period of time. And I was helping out the personal assistant of the CEO. And the CEO, of course, had a very full diary. It was an electronic diary. So all three of us, the director herself and the personal assistant and I, we all had access to this electronic diary in order to update it, to edit it, etc. And there was a very important meeting that the CEO had to attend in Cambridge. And it meant getting up very early to catch the train there, etc., etc. Anyway, the day came, and of course, myself and the personal assistant, we were still working in the office. We hadn't gone down to Cambridge with the director, but the director rang us sort of around 9:30 when we thought, funny, they should be in the meeting. It should be started by now. And basically, she was furious because the entry that she had put in the diary herself had been the wrong date. So the actual date of the meeting in Cambridge was going to be a week later. She had put it in 7 days earlier than the meeting was actually going to occur. So she'd gone all the way down to Cambridge for nothing. Okay, so that was that. The next day, when she's back in the office, and so were the two of us, each of us, myself and the personal assistant, we have this 10-minute private meeting with her in her office. And the director basically is telling myself off and the personal assistant off because we didn't spot her error that she'd put in the diary. We didn't spot that the meeting was actually on another day. And I suppose there was a faint chance of that because we had received a copy of the agenda for the meeting by email. But frankly, I don't know that I opened that agenda and read the date, and I'm not sure the personal assistant did either. We simply passed it on to the director so that she would have it and be ready for the meeting. None of us, because we hadn't been involved in putting the calendar appointment in ourselves, none of us had noticed that she'd put it in for the wrong date. And really, there was a very faint likelihood that we would even have known enough about the actual date of the meeting to have spotted that she'd done something incorrect. And I remember I was furious when those meetings were over. The personal assistant was a lot more philosophical. I think she had a different personality. And she just said, oh, that's Susan. She's just like that. And I was like, well, I don't care. I remember I was really kind of worked up like Thersites. I didn't deserve those blows given to me because I didn't know something that I couldn't have known. So, why should I be punished for it? It's a similar situation. And I'm saying all this because it is a bit of a digression, because what we're going to find as I now read through the chapter in Middlemarch is that we're going to see how some characters are treating some of the other characters, and maybe we can do kind of a Middlemarch version of Spot Thersites in these scenes. So let's do that. Let's go right to the text. He beats me, and I rail at him. Oh, worthy satisfaction! Would it were otherwise, that I could beat him while he railed at me. Troilus and Cressida. But Fred did not go to Stone Court the next day, for reasons that were quite peremptory. From those visits to unsanitary Houndsley streets in search of diamond, he had brought back not only a bad bargain in horseflesh, but the further misfortune of some ailment which for a day or two had seemed mere depression and headache, but which got so much worse when he returned from his visit to Stone Court, that going into the dining room, he threw himself on the sofa and in answer to his mother's anxious question said, I feel very ill. I think you must send for Wrench. Wrench came, but did not apprehend anything serious, spoke of a slight derangement, and did not speak of coming again on the morrow. He had a due value for the Vincey's house, but the wariest men are apt to be a little dulled by routine, and on worried mornings will sometimes go through their business with the zest of the daily bell-ringer. Mr. Wrench was a small, neat, bilious man with a well-dressed wig. He had a laborious practice, an irascible temper, a lymphatic wife, and 7 children, and he was already rather late before setting out on a 4 miles drive to meet Dr. Minchin on the other side of Tipton, the decease of Hicks, a rural practitioner, having increased Middlemarch practice in that direction. Great statesman air, and why not small medical men? Mr. Wrench did not neglect sending the usual white parcels, which this time had black and drastic contents. Their effect was not alleviating to poor Fred, who, however, unwilling as he said to believe that he was in for an illness, rose at his usual hour the next morning and went downstairs meaning to breakfast, but succeeded in nothing but sitting and shivering by the fire. Mr. Wrench was again sent for, but was gone on his rounds, and Mrs. Vincey, seeing her darling's changed looks and general misery, began to cry, and said she would send for Dr. Sprague. "Oh, nonsense, mother, it's nothing," said Fred, putting out his hot, dry hand to her. "I shall soon be all right. I must have taken cold in that nasty, damp ride." "Mamma," said Rosamond, who was seated near the window. The dining-room windows looked out on that highly respectable street called Lowick Gate. "There is Mr. Lidgett, stopping to speak to someone. If I were you, I would call him in. He has cured Ellen Bulstrode. They say he cures everyone." Mrs. Vincey sprang to the window and opened it in an instant, thinking only of Fred and not of medical etiquette. Lidgett was only 2 yards off on the other side of some iron palisading, and turned round at the sudden sound of the sash before she called to him. In 2 minutes he was in the room, and Rosamond went out, after waiting just long enough to show a pretty anxiety, conflicting with her sense of what was becoming. Lidgett had to hear a narrative in which Mrs. Vincey's mind insisted with remarkable instinct on every point of minor importance, especially on what Mr. Wrench had said and had not said about coming again. That there might be an awkward affair with Wrench, Lidgett saw at once. But the case was serious enough to make him dismiss that consideration. He was convinced that Fred was in the pink-skinned stage of typhoid fever, and that he had taken just the wrong medicines. He must go to bed immediately, must have a regular nurse, and various appliances and precautions must be used, about which Lidgett was particular. Poor Mrs. Vincey's terror at these indications of danger found vent in such words as came most easily. She thought it, quote, very ill usage on the part of Mr. Wrench, who had attended their houses so many years in preference to Mr. Peacock, though Mr. Peacock was equally a friend. Why Mr. Wrench should neglect her children more than others, she could not for the life of her understand. He had not neglected Mrs. Larcher's when they had the measles, nor indeed would Mrs. Vincey have wished that he should, and if anything should happen— Here poor Mrs. Vincey's spirit quite broke down, and her Niobe throat and good-humoured face were sadly convulsed. This was in the hall, out of Fred's hearing, but Rosamond had opened the drawing-room door, and now came forward anxiously. Lidgett apologized for Mr. Wrench, said that the symptoms yesterday might have been disguising, and that this form of fever was very equivocal in its beginnings. He would go immediately to the druggist's and have a prescription made up in order to lose no time, but he would write to Mr. Wrench and tell him what had been done. "But you must come again. You must go on attending Fred. I can't have my boy left to anybody who may come or not. I bear nobody ill will, thank God, and Mr. Wrench saved me in the pleurisy, but he'd better have let me die if— "I will meet Mr. Wrench here, then, shall I?" said Lidgett, really believing that Wrench was not well prepared to deal wisely with a case of this kind. "Pray make that arrangement, Mr. Lidgett," said Rosamond, coming to her mother's aid and supporting her arm to lead her away. When Mr. Vincey came home, he was very angry with Wrench, and did not care if he never came into his house again. Lidgett should go on now, whether Wrench liked it or not. It was no joke to have fever in the house. Everybody must be sent to now, not to come to dinner on Thursday, and Pritchard needn't get up any wine. Brandy was the best thing against infection. "I shall drink brandy," added Mr. Vincey emphatically, as much as to say this was not an occasion for firing with blank cartridges. "He's an uncommonly unfortunate lad, is Fred. He'd need have some luck by and by to make up for all this, else I don't know who'd have an eldest son." "Don't say so, Vincey," said the mother with a quivering lip, "if you don't want him to be taken from me." "It will worret you to death, Lucy, that I can see," said Mr. Vincey more mildly. "However, Wrench shall know what I think of the matter. What Mr. Vincey thought confusedly was that the fever might somehow have been hindered if Wrench had shown the proper solicitude about his, the mayor's, family. I'm the last man to give in to the cry about new doctors or new parsons either, whether they're Bulstrode's men or not. But Wrench shall know what I think, take it as he will. Wrench did not take it at all well. Lidgett was as polite as he could be in his offhand way, but politeness in a man who has placed you at a disadvantage is only an additional exasperation, especially if he happens to have been an object of dislike beforehand. Country practitioners used to be an irritable species, susceptible on the point of honor, and Mr. Wrench was one of the most irritable among them. He did not refuse to meet Lidgett in the evening, but his temper was somewhat tried on the occasion. He had to hear Mrs. Vincey say, "Oh, Mr. Wrench, what have I ever done that you should use me so, to go away and never to come again, and my boy might have been stretched a corpse?" Mr. Vincey, who had been keeping up a sharp fire on the enemy infection, and was a good deal heated in consequence, started up when he heard Wrench come in and went into the hall to let him know what he thought. "I'll tell you what, Wrench, this is beyond a joke," said the mayor, who of late had had to rebuke offenders with an official air, and now broadened himself by putting his thumbs in his armholes. "To let fever get unawares into a house like this, there are some things that ought to be actionable and are not so. That's my opinion." But irrational reproaches were easier to bear than the sense of being instructed, or rather the sense that a younger man, like Lidgett, inwardly considered him in need of instruction. For, in point of fact, Mr. Wrench afterwards said, Lidgett paraded flighty, foreign notions which would not wear. He swallowed his ire for the moment, but he afterwards wrote to decline further attendance in the case. The house might be a good one, but Mr. Wrench was not going to truckle to anybody on a professional matter. He reflected, with much probability on his side, that Lidgett would by and by be caught tripping too, and that his ungentlemanly attempts to discredit the sale of drugs by his professional brethren would by and by recoil on himself. He threw out biting remarks on Lidgett's tricks, worthy only of a quack, to get himself a factious reputation with credulous people. That cant about cures was never got up by sound practitioners. This was a point on which Lidgett smarted as much as Wrench could desire. To be puffed up by ignorance was not only humiliating, but perilous, and not more enviable than the reputation of the weather prophet. He was impatient of the foolish expectations amidst which all work must be carried on, and likely enough to damage himself, as much as Mr. Wrench could wish, by an unprofessional openness. However, Lidgett was installed as medical attendant on the Vinceys, and the event was a subject of general conversation in Middlemarch. Some said that the Vinceys had behaved scandalously, that Mr. Vincey had threatened Wrench, and that Mrs. Vincey had accused him of poisoning her son. Others were of the opinion that Mr. Lidgett's passing by was providential, that he was wonderfully clever in fevers, and that Bulstrode was in the right to bring him forward. Many people believed that Lidgett's coming to the town at all was really due to Bulstrode, and Mrs. Taft, who was always counting stitches and gathering her information in misleading fragments caught between the rows of her knitting, had got it into her head that Mr. Lidgett was a natural son of Bulstrode's, a fact which seemed to justify her suspicions of evangelical laymen. She one day communicated this piece of knowledge to Mrs. Fairbrother, who did not fail to tell her son of it, observing, "I should not be surprised at anything in Bulstrode, but I should be sorry to think it of Mr. Lidgett." "Why, mother," said Mr. Fairbrother after an explosive laugh, "you know very well that Lidgett is of a good family in the north. He never heard of Bulstrode before he came here." "That is satisfactory so far as Mr. Lidgett is concerned, Camden," said the old lady with an air of precision, "but as to Bulstrode, the report may be true of some other son." Right, so that's the text looked at. Now, we meet our first Thersites, I believe, of a kind, and that is Mr. Wrench. Mr. Wrench, who was mentioned just in passing back in chapter 18 when there was the vote taken to decide who was going to be the chaplain of the new hospital that Bulstrode was building, and Wrench just gets... His name is in there, but not a great deal is said about him. Now we're getting to know this man. And the narrator describes him as small, neat, and bilious with an excellent wig. Now, I think small and neat and the excellent wig, we're now picturing somebody very tidily dressed. Bilious is both a term that's been used medically and also psychologically. I don't mean medically now. I mean medically in the 19th century. Bilious could mean affected with nausea and vomiting, but psychologically, it could mean very, very mean and spiteful and bad-tempered. Almost, you think about if you vomit, what comes out of your mouth is disgusting, and if you're very bad-tempered, what comes out of your mouth is also disgusting. And then the narrator paints this picture of just the kind of pressures that Mr. Wrench was under at the time that he first looked at Fred Vincy and thought, I don't think we see anything too serious here, and didn't make any promise about coming to see the Vincys again and having another look. And we find out that across the other side of Tipton, the doctor who normally attended to patients there, Mr. Hicks, had been recently deceased. And unfortunately, this meant that Mr. Wrench and another doctor had to take on the additional patients. So that was increasing his workload. And perhaps he already had a very great workload. It doesn't really elaborate on that. Then he has 7 children and a wife who's described as lymphatic. And again, this is another term that had both a medical and a psychological meaning. Medically, of course, it had to do with lymph glands and all those tissues that can fill up with fluid in the body. And if that is excessive, it does impede movement, make people slower, make movement more difficult. I guess I should just go straight to that. And Mrs. Wrench, it seems, was lymphatic more perhaps she could have been in the medical and in the psychological sense. In the psychological sense, it just meant sluggish, not particularly energetic, not pursuing anything with any great alacrity. And when you have 7 children, I don't know how else you can cope unless you have a lot of energy and you pursue everything with all that energy that you have. So with all these demands on his time and attention, as the text says, there are some mornings when you're just going about your daily routine with not a great deal of enthusiasm. I think it said with the amount of enthusiasm of the daily bell ringer. I don't know what it was like to do a job as a daily bell ringer, but it doesn't sound challenging or fulfilling. So perhaps there were men who just did it with a clear sense of, all right, then here we go. I'll give it half my effort because that's all it really deserves. And at any rate, the situation must be stressful. And so Mr. Wrench comes in and his initial diagnosis of Fred is slight derangement. I have no idea what on earth was meant by that. I mean, because there is no corresponding medical condition known as slight derangement today. That just, no idea. But what's interesting is that Mr. Wrench has some medications delivered in a white packet. A white packet must have been the way they always came, I guess, because it seems to be, I think the adjective used is the expected white packet. But inside it were black and drastic contents, and I don't know what those are. I tried doing a Google search, but no one would really help me. And in the end, I had to wonder whether those were leeches, because they would have been delivered from not very far away. So every chemist would have probably kept some live leeches. And I guess it's an awful thought, but they may have been put into the packet because it may have been felt that if Fred was mildly deranged, he just needed to lose some blood. This was a medieval and early modern medical idea that you could remove bad humors out of the blood by just having some leeches take a bit of it out of you, and that this would sort you out and put you right again. So I'm thinking that's possibly the treatment. Now, if you've got a bacterial infection, if that's what's really the case, and it's leading to a fever, losing blood is probably a very bad idea. But there we go. I think that gives you a sense, and this chapter, I think, is meant to give you a sense of how utterly hopeless doctors were in correctly diagnosing an illness and then in giving anything like a treatment that would have any effect at all. Now, to us as modern readers, a lot of the comedy in this chapter surrounds the reaction of Mr. and Mrs. Vincey to this misdiagnosis and to the fact that Fred really does have a very dangerous illness. And I guess it's comic. I think to Victorian readers, this actually would have made the chapter quite tense, because Mrs. Vincey's reaction really isn't out of place for the 19th century. Losing children to these kinds of bacterial infections, they were very common. And I think most of my viewers actually know that. I think most of my viewers are well aware of what child mortality was like in the 19th century. But even so, I think it's just always helpful to look at the statistics anyway, because they're so shocking. The graph I'm going to show you now came from an online article in a publication called The Conversation. The article is titled "Infectious Diseases Killed Victorian Children at Alarming Rates. Their Novels Highlight the Fragility of Public Health Today." And then there are these graphs, which I'm going to put on screen now. The first one is showing the number of childhood deaths per 1,000 births from the start of the 19th century up until near the beginning of the 20th century. And you can see that for every 1,000 births at the beginning of the 19th century, over 400 of those children, so nearly half, would not survive. In other words, if you had a child in, let's say, 1810, you could flip a coin. You could flip a coin because your chances were about equal to a coin toss as to whether you would see that child become an adult or not. And I'm quoting from the article here where it says, the weekly magazine Household Words, that was, of course, Charles Dickens' publication, reported in 1853 the death of a 3-year-old from typhoid fever in a London slum contaminated by an open cesspool. But better housing, which the Vinceys had, of course, but the article says better housing was no guarantee against waterborne infection. And then it uses an American example of President Abraham Lincoln, who was, and this must be quoting from his own correspondence, was convulsed and unnerved, and his wife inconsolable, watching their son, Willie, who was aged 11, die of typhoid in the White House. This is what I mean when I say that dying of these fevers, it was no small thing. If you contracted one of these illnesses, there was no guarantee that your child would live. And since this novel is set in the 1830s, and you'll see, because we're still keeping the graph up there, that death rate is still very high in the 1830s. And so the Vinceys were right to be afraid. It makes sense why, given the amount of death the Victorian families had to deal with, why there was this incredible culture around mourning with all its clothing and rituals and time limits for when you couldn't do things. I think the only way to deal with that much death is almost to create a kind of religion around mourning. And as Mrs. Vincey is overcome with this emotion on page 260, and she's trying to tell Dr. Lidgett about things that don't really pertain to the diagnosis itself. And it talks about her Niobe throat being convulsed. And you might remember Niobe because we've dealt with her in a previous meditation, and I think it was in connection with Mrs. Vincey. Niobe was the nymph who boasted about having 14 children in front of Leto, who had only 2. Now, Leto had 2 extremely important children. She had the god Apollo and the goddess Artemis. Nevertheless, Leto was not pleased, and neither were her children, and so Apollo and Artemis carried out a bloody massacre of all Niobe's children. Some of the versions of the myth say that 2 survived, but, you know, the comparison with Niobe, of course, is just to show how distressing the loss of Fred would be to Mrs. Vincey. And then I'll touch again on Mr. Vincey, because I think it's lovely. He decides not to have guests come for dinner on Thursday. Good idea. But Mr. Vincey, I love how he tells the butler not to bring wine up from the cellar for their everyday drinking, but to go get brandy, because he's convinced that if you want to deal with an infection, it needs to be distilled alcohol. And what is funny is that by page 262, which is the time that poor Mr. Wrench has come to meet the family and face all their wrath, of course, that Mr. Vincey, I think the phrase that Eliot's narrator uses is, had been keeping up a sharp fire on the enemy infection, meaning he had been dosing himself with a fair amount of brandy, perhaps in his mind, to ward off infection. But what it also did was help him deal, I think, with all the stress in the household, the possibility that he could lose Fred. And so by the time Mr. Wrench steps into the Vincy household for the second time to find out that Dr. Lidgett has been called in to deal with his patient, and that he gets the full force of the family's emotions. You get Mrs. Vincy utterly distraught and wondering what did she ever do to Mr. Wrench to deserve that he not come again and see her son when it was quite clearly he was very ill and this was very serious. And Mr. Vincy, getting on his sort of mayoral authority voice that he knows he needs to practice, get good at, because that he's going to have to use that a lot. So he gets that on, but of course he's had a bit to drink too. So I can just imagine if this had been played out line of dialogue for line of dialogue, it would have made, I think, some hilarious exchanges. But Mr. Wrench, how does he react? Well, I think what is interesting in the text is the text says that he's less offended by what the Vincys say. Fine. He can take that. He can deal with that. But where he draws a line, where he feels it is absolutely unacceptable, is that he must be politely told by Dr. Lidgett that the diagnosis of slight derangement was in fact the early stages of typhoid fever, which by implication now it's saying, Mr. Wrench, you failed to spot this, and you failed to give the correct treatment because Dr. Lidgett has changed the medication, has said, no, what Mr. Wrench prescribed, don't use that. That's actually the worst thing that you could use at the time, which if it was leeches, it definitely was. That wasn't any help at all for a bacterial infection. But I think it's funny how Mr. Wrench says, or his thoughts are conveyed to us by the narrator, where it says, irrational reproaches were easier to bear than the sense of being instructed, or rather the sense that a younger man, like Lidgett, inwardly considered him, that is Wrench, in need of instruction. This was the big blow to Mr. Wrench. He could deal with the Vincys being the way they were. I mean, at the end of the day, if he had misdiagnosed typhoid, that was a pretty serious thing. He had to take the Vincys' wrath. But what bothered him most was this Lidgett, who you can tell from the rest of the chapter as it talks about what Mr. Wrench thinks of Lidgett's ideas, thinks that he's passing around some absolute nonsense. And it's interesting that he ends the paragraph on page 262 with this remark that this cant about cures, because Lidgett is getting a reputation for actually curing people. And Wrench says something to the effect of, that cant about cures was never got up by sound practitioners, which is, there's a joke in there, and I'm sure you've spotted it. It's that in the 1830s, it seems that it wasn't any business of the doctors to go curing people. What a load of nonsense. A good sound doctor didn't have this reputation for cures. What's that about? All that nonsense. That clearly set apart Lidgett as someone troublesome if he was curing people. And then poor Mr. Wrench, having been railed upon and beaten, really, from his point of view, he's probably got worse from it than Thersites did. This rumor starts. Probably it starts with Mr. Wrench and then Mrs. Wrench and then da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But it's interesting to see how it goes all around Middlemarch, and it does that thing that rumors do. It kind of morphs and grows. It becomes an organic thing of itself until there's all kinds of stories going around. And then Eliot introduces this character of Mrs. Taft. I'm not sure if we've met her before. I should have consulted my electronic copy of Middlemarch to see has she been mentioned previously. But anyway, Mrs. Taft, who according to the text is always counting stitches and gathered her information in misleading fragments. So while she's knitting and concentrating on that, she's only hearing pieces of what's being said around her, but she's gathering from all that. She comes out with this idea, which she tells Mrs. Fairbrother, that Lidgett must be Bulstrode's illegitimate son. And it's just, and I think what's lovely is Mrs. Fairbrother goes home all serious and says this to her son, to Mr. Fairbrother, in all seriousness. And of course, he reacts with explosive laughter. He must think, what do these old ladies come up with? What do they concoct? And he has to remind her. Now, I think you know, mother, because of course his mother's from a very good family, and so she's pleased to know that Lidget's breeding was good. When she first met him, she was pleased to know what family he was from. And now she seems to be suddenly accepting this irrational idea that Lidget is Bulstrode's son from some other liaison that is not known about generally. And Mr. Fairbrother tries to tell his mother off and go, that doesn't make sense rationally. And perhaps this is the point of the whole chapter, is there's just not a lot of rationality going on here. It really isn't. Mr. Wrench and the way he has handled the illness, the Vincey's reaction to the illness, probably the only rationality that has gone on in this chapter was Lidget's recognition that Fred was in an early stage of typhoid fever, and he had some workable remedies. He actually had some remedies that would do something, and he got those underway, and he gave the family instructions about how to nurse the patient. But around that tiny, tiny nugget of rationality, there's just this vortex of craziness, including the rumor mill that starts moving within Middlemarch and creates all kinds of stories about Dr. Lidget that simply aren't true. But this is the beginning of what will start to become a burden for Lidget. This much I know, even though I haven't read ahead. I know enough to think, this is going to cause him problems, because in any community of this kind that's so small and closely knit, once these kind of irrational rumors start, it's so difficult to have evidence to the contrary believed. And that, everyone, is the meditation done. In my description box is going to be a link to it's a downloadable version of Gregory Doran's RSC production of Troilus and Cressida, which if I get time, I will probably download and watch. And that's, I've got to kind of tie this all together, this business of will I or will I not watch Troilus and Cressida, with my next announcement, because what I've got to tell you all, that April is going to be an interesting month for me in a good way, in a very good way. I'm going to get very busy with other things. I've got some big events coming up that are family related. And so the last video that I will make on YouTube for April will be this coming Wednesday. And then you won't hear from me again until the first week of May. And so you shouldn't worry about it, because it is nothing terrible, nothing at all. Just a period of time, a bit of a break for me, and some things that are going on family-wise that I'm really looking forward to. And I may tell you when I come back, because when I come back and get onto the camera for the first time, I'll have to catch you up. And if there's anything I can share that's interesting and fun, then I will do so. In the meantime, everyone, have good reading, whatever that means for you. And I'll see you again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.